this, man. You like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. They're gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody sees nobody. Man, it seems like you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, like a dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old things.
All right, Kevin Dolan, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
You just have the best intros. It's such a fun intro. It's great to be.
Yeah, it's this might be narcissistic to say. It's the favorite part. It's my favorite part of the show, right? Like the content's great and all, but like I think it's pretty good. Well, the first one, which was sort of similar in tone, I did. So if you want to look at it this way, yeah, I created the genre of Boomhauer core, right? It's there are 2 songs in it, and both of them are the theme songs to my show. But that got copyright stricken, and so I have a buddy who's an actual real music producer, and I was like, "Hey, can you make a version of this?" And after he got over his like, "What have you done? Why did you make this?" He's like, "Yeah, sure, I can make something." So that was professionally done, which is why it turned out so well.
It looks great.
No, thank you, man. So yeah, I wanted to have you on because you wrote a very good piece, very sobering piece on the death of this Ukrainian refugee, Iryna, in Charlotte. Now, this story was sort of subsumed into the outrage over the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But before that, it had sort of broken containment, right? It had gone from being a regional story or like a crime story to being the story. So if you could, do you want to just summarize the events? I assume everyone knows what we're talking about, but my intention is for these shows to have a long shelf life. So there's a chance in, a year or so, this might not be so fresh in people's minds.
Yeah. Well, and even for me, I'm definitely on the, I'm interested in people not forgetting this story. But even for me, it feels a long way away. Like so much has happened since then. But essentially, yeah, she was stabbed in the throat by a, like retarded, crazy homeless person. And, she's surrounded by, people who take no notice as her blood is just spilling all over the subway floor. And, he's saying, I got that white girl. I got that white girl. And it's interesting in light of what happened with Charlie Kirk and the way that that's being contextualized as well. You can see how easy it is for, like, there's a tactic at play where you can personalize the violence so that you don't have to talk about the broader ideological ramifications of the violence. You can always say, well, he was just nuts, and like this, the fact that if it hadn't have been, I got that white girl, it would have been because my dog told me to do it, or I heard messages in my soup saying. But I mean, like the fact that he said I got that white girl, like there's so many people who are not shitting their pants crazy, who talk the same way, advocate the same violence. And you saw in the aftermath, like kind of between when we were still sort of doing the news cycle, what does it all mean, between Iryna's death and Charlie's, that there were, in fact, a lot of people being like, yeah, this is fine. Like, yeah, white people have it coming.
Well, and I think that it strikes at sort of a core conceit of progressive America, which is effectively the great sin of white Christian conservative America is this sort of bone deep prejudice, right? That they just hate people. And if we could be more like other groups, if we could be more communitarian, as was often said kind of 10 to 15 years ago, Michael Moore, for example, right, was constantly going on about, in the bowling for Columbine, right? We need to become more like minority communities in America. We need to become more communitarian. We need to become more group focused.
Dinner's like a ritual, in my
100%.
culture. Dinner's so important. Food, it's almost spiritual.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is everyone else is doing this except for you. So you need to catch up. And what we see in instances like this is, if anything, the opposite is true, that the sort of liberal attitudes towards race are not mutual. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule, and this is the constant refrain of conservative America. Imagine if the roles were reversed. Well, to be perfectly honest, we don't need to, right? We lived through Floyd. We remember what happened when, even in an official capacity, if a member of that group is killed, well, it becomes everyone's problem. And in this case, there were several things to it. You mentioned the fact that this woman bled out unaided, right? For at least a minute or so, no one came to her aid. Mm-hmm. Also, I don't know if you've looked around, Kevin, the entire world is not on fire, right? We haven't launched the world into a cultural revolution over this injustice. Yeah. Well, and thirdly, I don't know if you caught this detail, but there was actually a pretty big air gap between when this event happened and when it hit the media.
It's like 2 weeks.
It was exactly right. It was not the cell phone video which went around the world. And I say this not to go back to that old hobby horse of conservatives. Imagine if the roles were reversed, but to say that I think this was a shocking incident for many people because the violence was obviously horrifying. Almost immediately afterwards, it was the selective condemnation. Because I think for a great number of people, legitimately, if the roles had been reversed, conservative America would have been equally outraged, right? This is completely inappropriate. This should be done to no one. And when that is not reciprocated, I think a great many people looked around and said, well, wait a minute. Why don't you feel outraged? I thought we were equals. I thought there was equity, quote unquote, in that. But I'll throw it back to you.
So I'm going to throw another old conservative chestnut at you, which is the soft bigotry of low expectations. So
it's a time machine. We're going back.
Yeah, we're going back. We have to go back.
All right. We got feminazis, liberal Democrats. Got to bring that one out. I'm just gonna hear Rush Limbaugh, but sorry, I'll throw it.
Yeah. So there is an element of this which is, deliberate propaganda, deliberate frame control on the part of the media. There is also, just like dog bites man, man bites dog. When we have been trained, in a sense, to just expect bad behavior. And so when, an insane homeless person stabs someone in the throat, there's obviously a sense in which that should be news, but there's also a very real sense in which it's just not news, right? Like that's just how it is on this bitch of an earth, that's how people think about it. And that's also how these DSA, the sort of smelly wing of the leftist coalition. That's the way they talk about it. It's part and parcel of life in a big city. It's, grow up, these things happen.
Why are conservatives afraid of cities? Yeah,
exactly. I'm here enjoying my delicious burrito that you'll never know because you're afraid of the cities.
Well, I mean, and I can't remember the guy's name, but do you remember the incident of that New York Brooklynite guy who did get stabbed by a crazy homeless man, right?
Yeah.
And is laying on his back like this while his his then girlfriend basically grifts off his memory for the rest of her life.
Immediately dropped his ass. Right under the bus. Which,
can we just acknowledge? I feel like there's no more primal male fear than not only being killed, but being killed in a gay way, right? Where it's that is your memory forever. That's the ultimate. It's worse than death itself.
Man. Yeah. Yeah, you don't want to give anybody the ick while you're having your throat opened on live TV.
Just eternally playing in like a 30 frame a second, like 240p video from an ATM, just eternal ick.
Bummer.
But in all seriousness, right, you are describing something there, which is the expectation that this is simply how things are. It is, as Sadiq Khan said, right, part and parcel of living in, a thriving metropolis, to be, stabbed at a Taylor Swift event for children. And look, like, I think both of us here are realistic. We understand that in any society there is crime, there is graft, there are bad things, right? You can't get rid of it. But you look at a case like this where the guy was arrested 14 times.
That's the crux of it. Yeah.
And you're like, okay, well, that seems reasonable. Like maybe on arrest number 13, we take a long, firm look at this.
Yeah.
Right?
No, there's that chart that shows like recidivism and like what I think the way it's plotted out is for every guy in prison, that's almost all guys. For every guy in prison, here's what arrest they're on, right? Like this is this guy's 20th arrest or whatever. And it's a nice, clean curve, but then it's like the 23rd or 25th arrest. It's like there's this huge long tail of people who are on their 25 plus arrest. And I said this the other day, like it is crazy to think that a like 25 strikes and you're out policy would actually be like a meaningful improvement on our justice system. Like that would actually significantly reduce crime.
No, you're 100%. You're 100% correct. And look, there's sort of a right way and a wrong way to address crime. You look at something like England, where it is a horrible nanny surveillance state that has high crime, where it is dangerous, where it's the classic anarcho-tyranny problem mixed with the surveillance state, right? If you're driving, 31 in a 30, well, you get a $400 fine immediately, right? In 4K video from, 6 different angles. Right. But if you are a client group, as this DeCarlos was, again, right, that is simply part and parcel. And I think there's another angle to this as well, which is that sort of, and we'll go back to that old phrase, right? That soft bigotry of low expectation is something that is widely known but never explicitly stated. And so I think the fact that this woman was a refugee plays a large part in this, because almost any American who looked like her would have been told not to do that.
Yeah. Through
a million different euphemisms, right? There would have been a way to make it clear that was not wise. And that sort of, and this is what you got at your piece I thought was very interesting, that those sort of human institutions have been marginalized by managerial liberalism, right? The ways in which both people like DeCarlos would have been sort of managed, right? In a communitarian sense, but also the way in which people would have been sort of guided around danger, if you see what I'm getting at, have both been formalized and bureaucratized in obviously a system that does not work well for either usage.
Yeah. And there's both sides of it, which is like, yeah, if she'd been, from around here, she would have known not to sit directly in front of that guy. But also all of the white people have this coming. It's like she lived on the other side of her ancestors have done nothing but be and surfed for the last 500 years, 1,000 years. There is no legacy of oppression to point to here, except that she's white and attractive. And I think that I think Sam Hyde on his latest video was like, thank God she was attractive. Thank God she was hot, because that's the only way this rose to popular consciousness and engaged our sort of atrophied defensive instincts. And yeah, it's the what I talked about in the post is that you actually don't want Nurse Ratched. You don't want like the DMV lady deciding who's sane and who's not. And like at the time of deinstitutionalization, you had One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was a big part of that. You also had word coming in from the Soviet Union from defectors and dissidents about like, oh yeah, like it's like drapetomania. It's like they're calling, you know, your disinterest in socialism a mental illness, and they're locking you up for it. And like that control structure. So like there was a confluence of ideological impulses on the right and the left that were like, you know, let's stop institutionalizing all these people. But it was after all of the personal and all of the human instrumentation that you know, people like that used to be somebody's responsibility. They used to be their family's responsibility. They used to, like, someone was in charge. And I think basically what you have to do, you know, when we win in based world, the way that has to work is like, if someone's not accountable for their actions, someone else needs to be accountable for their actions. And like that person needs to be held responsible for what that person is permitted to do in public. You know, it's very hard to see how you get there from here without, you know, revolution. But it's another coup complete problem. But I think that is how you have to handle it. Like there's always a human being responsible.
Yeah, and I think that the reaction to this situation from obviously, you know, the local politicians is basically that, well, effectively nobody is at fault. Yeah. That, and this is a problem that Curtis Yarvin brought up, right? When a system is so decentralized, when it becomes very difficult to say who made the decision, well, what is to be done? Because it is, from a certain perspective, no one's fault. And in a hypothetical world in which there were, you know, I don't know, like the Tsar of Charlotte, at least then there was someone who you could say, well, you were the man who let this happen.
Yeah.
And it's a very real possibility. You know, you can imagine an alternate world where, you know, DeCarlos was a investment banker who just woke up one day, went crazy and killed someone. In which case, again, couldn't blame the authorities for it, right? Simply, it is a horrible, tragic case of random violence, which does happen. But in this case, when someone has had interactions with the law over a dozen times, you know, has consistently been what any normal person would view as a threat to public safety. And when that threat is finally realized, the system effectively throws up its hands and says, well, it's not anyone's fault, right? It is purely decentralized.
And if you can't talk about whose fault it is, then you have to talk about what went wrong. What are the structural factors that got us here? And what I see is basically guys like this are set loose in part. Deinstitutionalization is part of the story, right? But like also his family were probably not psychologically equipped to be responsible for him. And probably, and all sorts of like, just sort of like, okay. So then this is something I brought up in the post. Like there are extreme cases like this guy where he's like crazy in a way almost no one else is crazy. He's also aggressive in a way that almost no one else is aggressive. Like it's a perfect storm in a certain sense. But like there's this huge long tail of people who are like probably not crazy and aggressive enough to institutionalize, and probably not mentally defective in a way that we would acknowledge as like clinical and like, put them in a care home or something. But this huge long tail of people who are just like not equipped to deal with modern life. They can't understand a mortgage. They can't negotiate with a car salesman or a mechanic. They can't figure out their taxes and that is the environment. That is the broader underclass that, number one, produces people like this. They sort of throw off these outliers statistically. They also, create the sort of low-grade chaos and squalor that make these situations happen. But the most important one that I think we have to acknowledge is they create the democratic impulse that creates all these bureaucrats who let these guys off. Because it's that democratic impulse and people sort of, what would you call it? Political entrepreneurs who realize that there's power in essentially exploiting these people, taking advantage of the fact that they're not really, competent to operate independently. And they say, well, actually, like, I'm going to feed you a narrative that tells you why that is. And it's actually because of this invisible power structure. And so you vote for me and I'll be your champion against that. And I'll make sure that. And so when these, like, that's what makes more normal people, like less crazy people, sort of celebrate when OJ got off, or celebrate, that white bitch had it coming. Like it's rooted in a democratic machine that is generated by this mass of people who are adrift, and like you have to feel for them. Imagine just like living in a haze and just shit comes out of nowhere all the time, and you're just constantly getting screwed because you're dealing with people who just can get away with that all the time, and you have to have an explanation for that, right?
And this is one of the reasons why I refuse to let progressives have the moral high ground when talking about these issues, because okay, we've run this experiment, and look, the kind of low end of patronage, right? When you see that, high and low versus the middle squeeze that sort of typifies almost all of human politics. This has existed for a long time, right? The Romans figured it out. It probably existed before that.
Yeah.
So this isn't, from a certain perspective, novel, but the immense scale of, the American welfare state, of, effectively this Leviathan, which exists to sort of perpetuate an ever greater percentage of the population as wards of the state, right? In effect, it is so clearly not operating to these people's benefit.
Yeah.
Because if the problem was solved, they would no longer be reliable political patrons.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And this is a point that you see in Sam Francis, you see it in Land, right? Any one of these thinkers have realized that they don't actually want to make people healthy and competent. They don't want to make people independent, because the whole game is, I will give you gibs, right? In internet parlance, in exchange for your support.
Yeah.
But if you don't need gibs anymore, or if you can sort of negotiate, right? You can say, well, I'll maybe take my share somewhere else. You're no longer useful as a political battery. And so effectively, these people are on a political plantation, right? You've seen that language from even people I don't particularly like Candace Owens, but she's right about that.
Yeah.
Like there very much is an exploitative nature to this. And if you've ever been to these areas, you've ever worked in an institution that, services these people, it's very clear that they live immiserated lives. And sure, technically, they can get away with things that you or I, Kevin, might not be able to. Right? Like if I started stealing power from my neighbor, someone would notice and I would get in trouble very, very quickly. If I wanted to, take a a Kia for a spirited midnight drive, I would probably end up in a lot of trouble. But that's not really a great deal.
Yeah, it still wouldn't change places, right?
100%.
Yeah.
And it's so clearly a case where it's like, look, I don't have to adopt progressive morality to understand that this is an injustice, that this is fundamentally wrong. And so when these people, who've advocated for the system, who continue to adopt a moral tone, right? They try to grandstand, against you for this kind of like these invisible crimes. Quite simply, to quote Bowden, you have to step over them, right? They are not moral actors.
Yeah, I mean, they're lying. That's all there is to it. And I mean, and to some extent, we, there has had to be kind of a dialectic at play here where we do have to break out of their moral frame. And that I think, maybe 10 years ago, over the last 5-10 years, a lot of people have kind of, in the interest of breaking out of that moral frame, they've pursued a kind of like, I don't give a shit about any of this. I don't care about these people. I care about me, and I care about what my family and us and our thing. And I think in the service of breaking out of that moral frame, that was a healthy and kind of a necessary thing. But one of the things that I am just certain about is that our guys need to understand themselves as the good guys. They need to understand themselves as building a world that is actually better for everybody. Because we don't have the engine of spite and resentment. You're never going to outspite the left, right? You're never going to hate the way they hate. And it would be really spiritually and psychologically destructive to try. And so you have to get right with your conscience on all of this stuff. And the good news is, like, yeah, we actually we have a framework that, because it is more in harmony with reality and nature, it works better. It works better for everyone. There's so in my post that I just hit send on right as I was jumping on this call, I'm talking about essentially this need, because like with the Charlie Kirk thing, there's been a lot of like, he was just about dialogue. It was just free speech. It was just, he did nothing to provoke. And it's like, no, Charlie Kirk was a provocateur, and that's good. Like he was trying to win political power. Quietism and pacifism and endless dialogue are not the source of our moral superiority. It's not what makes us right. What makes us right, what means that we need to win and they need to lose, is the fact that we are on the side of reality. We are on the side of sanity. And so, and the way that cashes out, right? I was thinking about China. And there's a lot of things, at least that are, from the Chinese perspective, are going right in China right now.
Well, you have just sent James Lindsay into a fatal spiral. Woke right mentions China.
So how they got there, though. Leftism is basically a series of absurd propositions. It's a series of like empirically obviously false propositions, invisible spooks that are responsible for all of our problems. Like it's fake, it's imaginary. And so for a leftist to seize power, to rule, to get their way, they have to do two things. Number one, they have to appease the mutants that appeals to. right? Like Stalin and Mao, they needed their army of mutants, which means they had to give them the revolutionary terror that they were clamoring for, at least until they could consolidate power enough to, you know, get rid of those people, right? And then you could get back to sanity, right? But the other thing is, you had to shatter people psychologically. You had to break them down to the foundations so that they would enthusiastically and even like internally go, yeah, 2 and 2 makes 5. A man's a woman. Whatever you say, why not? Whereas a right-wing authoritarian, someone who is not inviting or tolerating challenges to their power, they don't have to do that. They don't have to make people believe absurdities. They don't have to break them down that way. And you can see that in like how these authoritarian regimes work. It's far gentler because there isn't this need to break people down before you can start rebuilding. And, you know, like obviously Mao and Stalin had to die before you could get a more sane and competent government. But it actually is the case that like Stalin and Mao were necessary to create that government's total control over the population. They had to terrorize them into submission. And so to bring it back, like because we're on the side of reality, the things that we can afford to tolerate and the level of actual diversity of thought that we can tolerate is actually a great deal higher because we don't have to break people down.
Yeah, there are several things there. I got into a lot of trouble with our side of the internet for saying that we owe Black America something. And I understand why, right? That was sort of deliberately, I guess, incendiary language for our side.
Yeah.
But it's actually true, right? And what I'm saying is we don't owe them another, I don't know how many trillions of dollars we've dumped into welfare programs.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, we owe everyone who lives here security and sensible governance. Similarly, like this woman, Iryna, right? It's like, look, she's not a citizen. I don't really think she should be here. But nonetheless, she is a guest. She deserves the protection of America. It is a part of our hospitality, right? That guests in our home cannot be murdered, right? In the same way that the Greeks would have understood that was the height of violating your duty to let a guest be murdered. Like that still applies today. And to your point again, right? It's like, I don't adopt progressive morality. I don't adopt the idea that, that you can sort of measure the moral legitimacy of a state by, how well it sticks to, progressive platitudes about, sexual, racial minorities and, certain classes. But even given that, right, even saying I disregard those moral precepts, the world we are arguing for will be better for those people, right? Good rule, right, is better than whatever this nonsense is. And I was talking to Merrick of the Good Old Boys yesterday, and he put it quite eloquently, where he basically just said, progressives have ruined everything, right? Anything they touch, anything they control, they bring it towards ruin. That idea of the left as entropy is very accurate. And it is genuinely upsetting to me. And you see this equally in the Anglosphere, in England, continental Europe, where your wealth is really measured in to what degree you can remove yourself from the consequences of progressive rule. And I'm not a communist, but that ought not to be the case, right? The entirety of your life should not be dictated to that degree by your liquid capital, right? We don't have to necessarily take this in a socialist direction to say that, men ought not to live like that, regardless of how much money they have.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the guys on the Great Houses call. So we have a bunch of weekly calls at Exit. And, the guy who runs the Great Houses call was talking about, Black America. And there's a a transition from personal to ideological relationship, where it went from, being part of a household. Like there's stories of Rome, where your servants would wear the emblem of your house, and if that emblem, if someone were to shove down your servant in the mud, and your emblem were to be besmirched, right? That would be the whole household's problem, and it didn't matter that this was a low status person, a bondsman, right? The point was they're part of your household, and you had an obligation toward them, and your honor was at stake. And the transition that we observe with, we call it chattel slavery because it means bad slavery, extra bad slavery, the worst kind, the kind white people invented.
Pay no attention to the gainfully employed 4-year-old who assembled your Apple Watch.
Right. The distinction that I think is actually meaningful was the ideological transition from personal relationships of hierarchy within a household to ideological relationships where any white person could mistreat any black person, and there was no bond of obligation. There was no sense of being under the protection of a house. That is actually immoral. That is actually wrong, and that is part of what became indefensible. And so yeah, but to bring it back, it is this sense of people being lost in ideologized bureaucratic institutions where, like, it's impossible to even imagine that institution like caring about a person, and or even understanding the part of it is, you don't want Nurse Ratched deciding who belongs in a mental institution, meaning the state, right? Partly because they just don't care about people, and they'll just do awful anti-human things for that reason. But also, these cases are particular, and there are gradations of accountability. There are gradations of what people should be allowed to do. And the person who is best equipped to make those kinds of decisions is, the responsible party who is the most intimately connected to that person, usually, a patriarch, right? That's what I think we should be getting back to is human government at human scale in our natural milieu, which is families.
Well, and why was Marxism so powerful? Well, Marxism was powerful because it addressed a then very real issue, which is that the underclass, who had been serfs, who had been sort of landed slaves, well, they had been kicked off their land and they had lost their safety net, right? They still were ruled, but the responsibilities on a feudal ruler had been enscombed, right? They were no longer a serf where, well, sure, you couldn't leave, but you were given access to all of the tools to provide for yourself, right? There was a social safety net, everyone in the area worked. And so if you got injured, there was a way to sort of secure yourself through your life. Well, what had replaced this, right? Early industrialization, where you have in England, right? Tens of thousands of people cut loose, right? Stuffed into these tenement houses, working incredibly dangerous jobs in incredibly dangerous urban centers where there was no corresponding obligation from their employer to them. If they were injured, they were out of a job. They had to work, horrific hours for very low wages, and there was quite simply nothing else to do. There was no give and take. There was no reciprocal obligation. And of course, in that context, Marxism seems to provide an answer to that. Obviously, it was a bad answer, right? It didn't quite work out well. Yeah. But this is a problem that there are systems that take this into account and have lasted for a very long time. Whereas our current system sort of decidedly puts those concerns to the side, and we are forced to deal with the chaos of it. Right? This is not some pie in the sky idea that, everyone will have, perfectly pleasant lives, at all moments. Far from it. But this is something that humans knew how to do for generation upon generation upon generation. And we forgot, to our own detriment. This is not like faster than light travel. This is a system that has existed for most of human history.
Well, and you can talk about why that happened. So my model for this, like how we got here, is that there is always a tension between cohesion and scale. There's power in cohesion. There's power in we are us and we have common interests, and love is another word for it. Basically, we love each other. We consider, I consider your interests as my interests. And then on the other hand, if there's just a hell of a lot of us, then there's all kinds of things we can do and all kinds of power we can obtain because there's just a lot of us. And so it's always this tug of war between how can we maximize scale while maintaining cohesion as much as possible. And the development of our technological environment has radically increased the returns to scale over time. And so people who were cohesive in families or tribes or clans, in the sort of the natural, what would you call a pack structure that humans as animals are kind of built to live in, they get out competed by people who we just have a lot of us. There's just tons of us. And that process over and over has led us to look for, all right, how can we scale up to compete in this new technological environment without losing our cohesion? And so we take these primitive circuits, these neurological circuits of obligation that we are built with, primarily the connection between a parent and a father and a son, really. And we say, how can we abstract that? So you've got patronage, right? You've got patriotism, you've got patriarchy, you've got all these patter words, right? That the king being the pater patria, the father of the fatherland. Feudalism being patronage being an abstraction, right? You're not literally my son, but we have obligations that are like that. Feudalism being that patronage relationship nested fractally so that it can scale, right? And then when the technological instruments of scale become so large that even that fractal pattern is no longer sustainable, you get the nation, right? Which is, we don't know each other, but we are descended from the same fathers. That's what the patria is. It's the land of your fathers. It's where your fathers are buried. And eventually, even that scale becomes inadequate, and we have to become essentially ideological. And then patriotism becomes, it's almost homeopathic. It's like that circuit of patronage, of fictive father-son relationship gets abstracted to where it excludes nothing and includes everything, and therefore is meaningless. And that's where we're at, is that we have stretched our ability to abstract loyalty and mutual obligation and asabiya and cohesion. We've abstracted that to the breaking point. We no longer have anything in common, and the state now exists. Instead of the state existing to represent our interests and protect us from the outside, there is no outside. So the state exists to protect us from each other. and it grows in power, it expands in influence by stoking conflicts among us. By instead of holding us together, it tears us apart, because that's the only political energy left in the system, is breaking those bonds and essentially taking the side of the weaker party against the stronger. And that's the sense in which Curtis Yarvin talks about equality until there's not one stone left upon another. Like that's the equality that the state seeks out. It's a starving creature eating itself.
Yeah, there are several things there, because one of I think the most important errors of modernity is the idea that only affirmative consent matters when we're talking about bonds, that only chosen bonds are fundamentally legitimate. Because when you think about the relationship between a father and son, it is not one born out of consent. I did not choose my father. And those unchosen bonds are in many ways more meaningful, right? There is a sense of ownership to those bonds, right? When you say my father, my city, my country, any of these things, there is a reciprocal ownership there. There is something given and taken. And that ownership is what lends something significance. Obviously, Kevin, if you got on here and said, well, my wife was just murdered, I would be horrified. Whereas if you said a wife was murdered, I mean, that's equally horrific, but quite clearly there's much less significance associated with that. So, sorry, it's kind of a dark example, but you know what I mean. And when we move to a world of chosen bonds, we move to a world where identity, where meaning is the only acceptable way to grasp at that is through sort of consumer identities, right? Through this kind of stack of different social signifiers you choose to sort of arrange on your personal and or digital profile. Mm-hmm. Well, very clearly that is one, or you could say, I guess you could say it's a surrogate activity, but also it is a poor solution for those ancient circuits you were describing, that people are designed to have meaningful things about them that are not chosen. So for example, you can imagine in sort of a European context 1,000 years ago, you didn't get to choose where you went to church. There was a church and you went there. It doesn't mean that you were particularly devout, that you cared about it, but that was not a available consumer choice to you, let alone all the others. And I think in addition to what you've said, because your point about breaking political bonds to release energy is spot on, but it reminds me of a point from Lowell as well, which is the more of these choices that are conscious, the more that you have to decide, am I a Coke man? Am I a Pepsi man? Am I a man at all, right? What am I? The more susceptible you are to propaganda, because your available pool, your sort of action points, if we want to, be nerds about it, are taken up with, what's that?
It's free energy. There's lots of free energy. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that there's a lot to what you've just said.
Yeah. And it's when we talk about it being structural, there's always a challenge when you're trying to be explanatory of making these things seem mechanistic and inescapable. I do think it's important to understand how we got where we are, but there's also some encouraging trends and things are changing. I mean, for one thing, I'm sort of working on a little kind of trolling piece. I mean, a lot of people know that I ran the Natalism conference and have taken an interest in why people aren't raising families. I'm working on this piece that's basically like, hey, birth rate collapse is actually the good news, because the doomer thesis, the infinite nihilist acceleration thesis, is that people will endure this indefinitely, and it's never going to stop. It's totally self-sustaining. But the fact is, we're learning, and I've identified 3 dimensions on which this train is not going to continue indefinitely. Number one, people are not having kids. They're it's like the pandas. They've decided that the artificial environment that you've put them in is not adequate, and they're just not going to live that way. They're not going to keep going. Number two, they don't fight for this. Like, people will not enlist to defend these systems, which means that other systems that do engender sincere loyalty and asabiya will overcome these systems. And number three, nobody invests in these systems. They invest in the casino sense of, quarter to quarter, maybe I can get a return, but they're not building for the long term. Nobody, particularly with respect to like any Western government's fiscal situation, absolutely nobody, not even the conservatives, think of that fiscal problem as like, this is my nation, I own it, and I'll be held responsible for it, and therefore I need to maintain it. There's none of that. Everybody is spending the commons, burning it down. And so for those three reasons, you can observe not only like, we expect it to fail. It's like it's failing. It's failing right now. And we're also observing from a technological perspective, the inevitability of increasing returns to scale is starting to break down. Like, we had 2 giga-scaled, ideologized global empires for most of the 20th century. And then for a little while, we had just one, essentially world government. And that was a consequence of the fact that only giga-scaled, enormous states could field standing armies in the millions and could build aircraft carriers and could build fighter jets and tanks and all of this technology that made them unstoppable in terms of force projection. And like the fact that you've never seen a fortification, like an actual overt like defensive structure that's relevant in your life anywhere, is because you live in a completely controlled, completely secure environment where none of that's necessary. Well, now we have decentralized finance, and now we have drones, and like the cost to exert state level power is accessible to like anybody who could get like an undergrad in engineering. Like, that's anybody can, a 3D printer, you get your like, there's no way to control the supply chain for drones in a way that matters. Like, all of this stuff, all this force projection that used to be state level is in the hands of anybody and everybody. And so, because these giga-scale, like aircraft carriers are obsolete. The Red Sea is still closed. It's been, I think, years now. I think it's been like 2 years. We are trying not to. The U.S. government is trying not to test the hypothesis that their carriers are obsolete. But the fact that they're unwilling to run that test suggests that they're pretty confident that carriers are obsolete. If it came down to a confrontation, they would not be able to defend them. Which means, like carrier strike groups are what uphold the dollar. They're what uphold the whole international system. I mean, they're what keep Zimbabwe dysfunctional. They're, like there's so much about the world that is defined by this military technology that hasn't been put to the test in a while and probably doesn't work. And so the point of all that is to say we are coming into a new paradigm in which it is not obvious, actually, that atomized, giga-scaled, faceless, bureaucratized, managerial, whatever you want to call it, is actually the most competitive paradigm. That human beings with strong cohesion, and the ability to let some things go unsaid and to coordinate without legible communication may have they may strictly outcompete these bigger structures, which I think is extraordinarily good news, although the path to get to a new equilibrium will be very messy.
So, Kevin, unfortunately, I have a hard out, which means we're going to need to wrap up. I thought there was a lot said there that was great. I think that before we get to the shilling section, I think that you're entirely correct that the girders which upheld this bizarre, like, hegemonic global system, right, where there's sort of, red and blue super state. Well, not only are those creaking, but the conflict between the two of them that defined the 20th century, that made it the century of ideology, are dead and gone. And so much about our government, the way we organize, is predicated on Cold War realities, right? That is the reason America exists, is to fight the Cold War. And with that gone, all of these internal contradictions are made manifest. We see them because, the sort of the required load on the system is no longer there. And so, many of these things that would have been kept under check in order to fight the hypothetical, super war against the Ivans, well, all of a sudden those limiters are gone. But Kevin, you mentioned Exit Group. Where can people find your work if they want to hear more of it?
Yeah, so it's exitgroup.us. That's the URL for the fraternity itself. I write at blog.exitgroup.us. That's where a lot of these takes are being developed. And I also post like the cocktail hour invites for we meet up all over the country every week. So go check out the blog and specifically the cocktail hour invites to come get to know the guys.
We'll definitely highly recommend that. A lot of my fans are an Exit Group. Even my sponsor, Axios Remote Coaching and Fitness, JD, he's a Exit Group guy. And I'll be honest, I am one of the worst podcast to sponsor because he has sponsored me for years, and I think I remember to let people know about his service roughly 50 to 60% of the time. Like
Axios,
if it's that one. Go to there. There's a link for it. I use it all the time, and I'm a very bad sponsor. You should make JD feel better about that by checking it out. Otherwise, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. Episodes early and ad-free on Patreon, Subscribestar, anywhere you want to give me a few bucks. Again, Kevin, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.